Hello everyone, Love's Finest here. I just want to say that today's story is going to be a pretty interesting one. It's called War Stories by Anonymous. There is no name, so I'm just filling it in with, Anonymous. But nonetheless, I hope you guys enjoy the creepypasta War Stories. My great-grandfather was an old war veteran. He went throughout World War One and Two, doing the best he could against the Axis forces. He was part of the British Army, considering the fact that we obviously live in England. Nevertheless, his stories were pretty entertaining, and I remember him telling me a lot of them as a kid. Even if they were just bedtime stories, they were still pretty entertaining, and I always pictured my grandfather as this hero, essentially. I mean, he was, in his own right, of course. He's actually the person who inspired me to join the military and do what's best for my country. Now obviously, I'm not saying I could stack up to what he was. He was something far greater than me, and what he had to endure was terrifying enough. But that being said, it led to one story that he told me not that long ago. At least, it doesn't seem that long ago, but it must be now, considering the fact that he's unfortunately long gone. At the time, I was about 10 years old. This was around early 2005. My grandfather, one time, when it was a family reunion, was talking to me about how his day was going. It was pretty good, and he just talked about general stuff, when all of a sudden, I asked him in conversation if he had any more war stories. That being said, he said he had quite a lot, and as a matter of fact, there is one that he didn't want to tell for various reasons, but the main one being it just wouldn't be very suitable for me to hear. I was curious though, however, and I at least wanted to know a little bit, when my grandfather said, "Yeah, okay, I mean, I guess you're old enough to hear it, but just promise me one thing, buddy. You won't get too scared now, will you?" I looked up at him, beady-eyed, and he looked at me with that signature classic grin of his, the kind of heartwarming grin that he would constantly give to show that everything's okay, as he then began to narrate his story. Well, during the Axis invasion of France, I was fighting with them at the time to help repel some of the Germans and push them back. As you can imagine, we weren't doing very great on that front. Their forces obviously did the best they could, but they couldn't hold back the Germans with their heavy artillery and many more outnumbering guns. The only thing we could really do was fall back, and that's what we did. Some, unfortunately, got lost within the rubble and destruction of the now desolate place that was once an area within France. Probably bustling with people and people doing their daily activities as they once did without any harm or threats. Nevertheless, you probably know how bad it got from there. The German forces repelled us to our homeland. Tried to fight them off, of course, which we did pretty well, although it was mainly air combat. What happened from there, I asked. Not all that much happened on the ground, kid. He said, doing his wholehearted chuckle, which he usually would do to lighten up the situation. I listened intently, waiting for the next part, which he then began to talk about. Well, you see, kid, I was doing what I had to, really, just propelling the forces back. I was actually held up in a separate stationary bunker, not too far from all the action. I was basically picking off as many people as I could to give my friends cover, when one of my friends said that there was an opening. We could charge and then mow down the remainder of their forces. We weren't all that far away from no man's land, so it was pretty dangerous, but it was at least worth the shot. We were given exclusive orders if we could to push them back anyway, so we went along with it. My friend gunned down 2 of the soldiers that were about to pursue him, while I then covered the others as they ran up as well. We actually drove them into one of their own makeshift bunkers. Surely enough, we had orders to lock down and secure it, considering the fact that it could be a strategic advantage if they were to ever invade again on our home soil. We went further in exploring while also chatting to our peers about the war and how it's going so far. My friend, Alan, then discovered that there was a trap door. It was then ordered by the general that me and Alan would go in and basically search the lower bunker to see what was in there. The lower bunker area was actually pretty wide and expansive, with many different tunnels leading to what assumedly was different parts of the bunker. One was a medical bay, and the other was a weapons and ammunition storage facility, at least from what I can remember anyway. However, we then realized that before we could relay our findings to the general, there was a massive door in the center leading to another hallway or possibly even room. We decided to go in and discovered that it was open. In there was a bunch of machinery, like you'd see at some kind of high-tech radio studio or whatever those things are like. And, well, within there was a bunch of classified or unreleased documents that weren't sent back to Germany, at least we assumed. And that's when we saw that in the corner of the room there was a piece of one-sided glass that covered something from looking at us. We then saw an iron door that was rusted leading into the room. Granted, we didn't want to go in there, as you can imagine, but my grandfather then paused as if he was repulsed by something. Looking back on it, maybe it was the sheer memory of what he was about to witness. After all, it would haunt him for quite a bit, at least so he said to me afterwards. My granddad then resumed, although very quickly realizing that maybe he shouldn't, as he then said, "Hey, maybe that's enough of the story, I think. After all, I don't want to scare you too much. Also, I think dinner might be ready now." I then begged him just to tell me the last part. My granddad then did his iconic chuckle. "You drive a hard bargain there, kiddo. Oh well, I'll tell you then. Though, be warned, this part isn't exactly the nicest," he said. I immediately got ready for the story of a lifetime, when he then continued. I put my head up to the one-sided glass. It was all steamy, and I couldn't see much, but I could make out the faint and blurry shape of what appeared to be some Nazi officer, or officer of some kind, in that part of the bunker. I looked over at Alan, and he was staring at those books and documents. I called over to him and said, "Hey Alan, you gotta check this out. I think there's someone in there, probably a prisoner of war." And on top of that, he looks to be one of his own. The Nazi forces. "Oh really?" Alan said. "So what do you say? You suppose we should go pay him a visit?" My grandfather then nodded with a sly chuckle. "Yeah, let's go give him a piece of our mind." We were about to make our way in when all of a sudden, the thing, we got a better look at it. Its head, a ghostly pale white. Its uniform, tattered and almost completely ripped. And worst of all, its face. It bore the resemblance of a human. even if it was that of a dead one. My granddad said, with even more repulsion in his voice as he spoke, "You know, it was a pretty horrible sight, kiddo. There was a lot of things that I tried to block out from my memories, but the face and its eyes and everything was just grim." At that moment, I couldn't do anything else but stare as the thing leapt at Alan, and my grandfather trailed off after taking a moment to breathe heavily. It began to peel at him, almost like his skin was an orange, as he then bit into the core of it as the juice spilled down his face. I remember it eating his eye, and then, when I shot the thing, my friend turned to me, begging for a bullet to be placed within his brain. I looked at him, shocked but merciful, as I shot him in the head, saving him the trouble of turning into whatever that was. I then saw more of them approaching, the same tattered Nazi uniform, and the crests, and the hats, the eyes, the faces, the ghostly white skin color. I didn't have enough ammo, and I had to leave. I locked the door and watched as they began to feed on the fresh corpse of my dead friend. It's only after that I decided to run away and up the bunker, telling my squadron to get out of there now. But by then, it was already too late. I knew that they perhaps wanted outside to tell of this bunker and maybe make some use out of it. I didn't have much else to say at that moment. I felt sick until I realized that there was still hope. There was a radio transmitter. I used it, made contact with the general, and told him that this base was rigged with explosives and not to come back. Sure enough, that luckily they listened. And the fear I felt in that very moment was comparable to that of being lost in a place that you aren't welcome in at all. And I knew I wasn't welcome when I heard their screams. They'd broken out of the door and were about to climb their way up to the main part of the bunker. I had no choice. All I had was about 3 grenades and 3 rounds or so that was in my magazine, and I decided that I might as well make use of those grenades. I chucked them down the cellar door to where the lower floor of the bunker was and watched as it exploded the remainder of those corpses. However, I was shocked when I saw, just for a brief moment before he truly died, my friend's decaying corpse crawling ever so slowly, getting closer and closer to the ladder before he then finally died. And with that, I left. I never looked back. After all, I couldn't after the horrors I faced. In the end, I was just as shocked as my granddad. And I said thank you for telling the story, and it's almost like he then returned to reality. "Oh, it's fine, kiddo, don't worry, but I don't think you should perhaps, hear any more of these war stories," he said while giggling. We then made our way back to the dinner table and ate our food relatively silently. The day passed, I went home, did my daily routine of playing games, and shortly after that, continued on with my life, which leads up till present day. As I've stated, I've listed in the military right now. Now, I don't know if this is just a coincidence, but I'm actually friends with a guy named Alan. And strangely enough, I actually went to visit that bunker with Alan at some point. And when we did, Alan looked intently at it as we made our way down to the forgotten parts of it. All that was down there was just a bunch of Nazi flags, completely untouched. There were bones littering the ground, which I could assume were from the true story that my granddad had told me. But one of the most unsettling things about this was when I called out for my friend Alan, and he was nowhere to be found. I screamed out Alan's name, but he didn't reply, and as I went to look outside, I saw him fade away as he looked at me for the last time. I knew who that was. It was Alan, probably watching over me to make sure that I don't suffer the same fate. And to think that I just thought it was all war stories.